We have such big dreams for our kids and ideas about what their lives will be like. We also have really big expectations that we're going to have a wonderful parenting experience. But sometimes we get a reality check and things end up being much different than we expected. And maybe it happens because your child is using substances, or they could come out about their gender or sexuality, or reveal something about themselves that feels completely unexpected and different than everything that you believed was going to be true. And these unexpected outcomes can really shake the foundation of who we thought we were and who we thought our child would be. And those dreams that we had about our parenting experience and what their life was going to be like start to disappear. And then in their place, we're left wondering, like, what's going to happen now? And so that's the intersection of where today's conversation is going to take place, because whether your child's journey takes them through addiction, identity, or any other unexpected path, the core challenge that we face as parents is really similar, because we are asked to confront our fears, we're asked to question our beliefs, to choose love when our instincts try to get us to control and fix or change. But we can have peace when we stop resisting the reality of what is and open up to seeing things in a different way. My guest today, Meagan Skidmore, understands this. When her child came out as transgender, it forced her to re examine everything she thought she knew about love, faith, and parenting. Her upcoming book, TransparentSEE: How I Learned to See Through My Journey as a Parent of a Transgender Kiddo, tells a story of what it means to truly see your child and yourself through love instead of fear. So I invited Meagan on today because even though our stories look different on the surface, the emotions underneath, the grief, the love, the surrender, that's the same. And it helps me to realize or remember that there are parents out there facing all kinds of challenges with their kids. I'll never forget the first time that I was listening to a mom on a podcast talk about having a child with autism and how that impacted their life. And so much of what she was talking about reminded me of my own experience. And it helped me to see that there is struggle in this human experience, and there is suffering that all of us are going to experience, and that I'm not over here just alone getting picked on by life. So, whether your child is struggling with substance use, identity, or something else entirely, my hope is that this conversation today is going to remind you that we all need the courage to learn to love without conditions. So, Meagan, thank you for being here today. Um,
Thank
I
you
know
for
that
having me.
I know that our audience is full of parents who never imagined that they would be on the path that they're on. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and take us back to when you realized your parenting experience was going to be different than you expected?
Yeah, thank you for letting me share my story, Heather. I think the start of it, although I was probably uh, in denial somewhat, was when I first learned about how my kiddo identified in the LGBTQ plus community. It was not something that he told me. It was something that I read in a text. Both of our kids were still young enough that I was getting their texts, screening them. And I had had some inklings that something was happening, emerging, we could say, a side of my kiddo that my traditions, my faith, my religious teachings had taught me to fear. I have the benefit of hindsight right now. So as I'm sharing this with you, I'm filling in blanks that at the time it just felt like this, whirlpool of emotions, of fear, of lack of clarity. But getting that text, I remember we were at Dallas Broadway. It was June 2019. And so the playbill was in rainbow colors. And the text came through then from a friend. And in that moment, I might have had the inkling that I think our life is going to be different, but simultaneously that thought was replaced with, we'll get through this, we'll figure it out. There's ways to make this work. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I think it was about a year later, a little over a year later, where I had processed a lot of emotions, a lot of realities, that things really were very different. My lived reality was very different than what I had been taught to expect through my religious upbringing. And something had happened in our communication between our kiddo and my husband and I. And so there was a moment where I had an opportunity to just take him squarely by the shoulders and express my love and just openly admit, I'm realizing there are a lot of things that I don't know, that I used to think that I knew. And I am learning as I go here. I don't know what the way forward necessarily looks like, but I do know that you are created just as God intended. You are perfect the way you are, and I love you unconditionally, and we'll make our way forward. We'll work through this, which was huge. I think I still felt some traces of the original fear, worry that then became anxiety, but I had been able to process enough of that by that point that I could verbalize. I think I had to acknowledge it to myself first, and then speaking it out loud to my child at that time. You know how it helps you embody something when you own it, especially claim it in a way with someone else, whether that's written or spoken and whatnot. I think, yeah, did that answer your question? I'll wait before I move on.
Yeah. You mentioned that it brought up a lot of emotions for you and that it challenged your beliefs.
Mhm.
Can you share a little bit about that? Because I think
Yeah.
if had I not had the opportunity to stop and or maybe the opportunity was presented to me, a way to challenge my beliefs, to look at them, everything in a different light, I wouldn't have had the relationship with my daughter that I did, where I was able to have that repair. So I'm
Mhm.
just curious, like, how did you go through that process of really looking at lifelong beliefs and ideas in a different
Mhm.
way?
Yeah. I appreciate you making that point. I think it's these tough conversations that truly do help us connect ultimately on a much deeper level in ways that maybe we wouldn't have otherwise. I think that's what I heard you say about you and your daughter. Totally get that. In the beginning, I felt these strong fears and anxieties and worries. And that stemmed from my perception, my view on my familial connections. In the LDS faith, the belief is we are sealed or married. Sealed is it's an ordinance, I guess yeah, it's an ordinance that's in addition to, like, acknowledged or seen or honored by God that ties you with your families beyond this life into the eternities. And that ordinance is performed in LDS temples. And so this is the belief that I had growing up and adhered to. You know, my grandparents on both sides were both married and sealed in an LDS temple. My parents were, and many of their siblings, and I was. And so I had rested comfortably in that belief, in that certainty, in that assurance. And because for many years, the belief in the LDS Church, the doctrine was to identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and so on was a sin. In more recent years, that has been changed to it's not a sin to identify or feel that way, but it is to act on it. So for me, this new knowledge, it shattered that certainty that I had. It that foundation that I had built myself, my life, my belief system upon crumbled. In the book that I wrote that's publishing as we talk here, it was I describe it as feeling like this earthquake that just ripped through the chapel, the church building where you're sitting, you know, and enjoying the sermon, the meeting, and it destroys the pew that you're on, and your family is hit by it, and you're in need of triage, you're wounded and bleeding. And that's when you look up and you realize you're the only one that's been hit. And that is truly how it felt. I felt very different from those. And people didn't talk about it. You know, and that was only 6+ years ago. And that was pre-pandemic. So that also came into play as well. But for the purposes of this question, yeah, all of that fear, all of that big emotion had to be seen. It had to be acknowledged and then moved through. I like to say metabolized, right? Energy doesn't just disappear. You can't just create it. It shifts form. And so I had to learn ways to address what was coming up for me. And I have, and I did. And I'm in a completely different place now than I was for sure 6.5 years ago.
Yeah, I think I felt that same kind of shaking of my foundation.
Mm-hmm.
That, like, how could this happen to me? And I just had so many judgments, as far as substance use went, families that had struggles with substance use. Like I had all of these, stigmatized beliefs, I guess you'd call them. And, you know, working through them really opened my eyes to life. I look at life in a completely different way
Mm-hmm.
now. How has this changed how you see the world now?
That is such a good question. Um, After the initial, um, rocking of my foundation and learning to pick myself back up and feel all those emotions, and healing is cyclical. It's like a spiral. You're going to come back to similar issues, but with new eyes, right? But once I had gotten to a place where I could be more purposeful about the way that I was moving forward, that's when I began to see that I had come to rely on so many external things to define my world, external teachings, external, I'll say examples of how to be as a woman, a spouse, a parent, a person of faith, my role as a woman, whether or not to work outside of the home, for instance, how many kids to have, and also just my appearance, right? And also beyond that, how my family should look. That picture perfect family portrait on the wall, we could say. And so many ways. And also, I suppose, what that picture perfect spouse looked like, kids looked like. And I started to realize how much that was hurting me. And the point that came when I really truly realized that was I mentioned in 2019 is when I first learned of my kiddo's identity. About not quite 2.5 years later, 2 and 3 or 4 months, he came out as transgender, which is different than gay, which is what the initial sharing of identity was. And so, in many ways, I felt like my journey was starting over because, as much as navigating this knowledge of my child being gay was challenging to take in and understand, I feel like I had come to a really good place of acceptance, and I was defining my faith journey on my own terms by that point. And it's really hard to say this out loud, even now, but I really didn't know much about that identity, and I didn't understand it, and I was probably afraid of that. That's so hard to say out loud, but I think it's important so that others listening, whether you're a parent, maybe you're an auntie or an uncle, maybe you're a grandparent, just know you're not alone if you're feeling some of these things. Let's normalize the human experience in all of its messiness and rawness, but also beauty and even bittersweetness, right? I was so afraid of losing the child who I had given birth to, who was born with female genitalia. That's really what this is boiling down to. The doctor sees a penis, you're assigned the. I've learned that there's gender and sex are not the same thing. So really, they're assigning a sex of male. People will interchange it and think that that's gender. And if you're born with a vagina and whatnot, you're told your gender, or it's really sex. It's not gender, and I'll explain the difference in a minute. Is female. And just as a side note, I have since learned that's only the external genitalia, right? That completely misses that there are babies, there are individuals who are born with some combination of both. And some of that is on the inside. That's a whole nother topic and discussion. But to kind of drive home the point that sex assigned at birth is really based on the genitalia that can be seen. Anyway, I bring that up because I was so afraid of losing that child that I had raised up to that point. And it was through, I purposely chose to lead with love, whether you're of a faith background or not. There is a scripture in 1 John 4:18, and it's something that I've tried to live my life by. And it says, perfect love casteth out fear. And as I have tried to embody that in my life, I have had better outcomes. And so I purposely chose to lead with love. And when it says perfect love, if you do your kind of the etymology research behind the Bible, perfect is referring to the word whole, not perfect like we think of perfect, checking off boxes, like this is what love looks like, and I'm doing all of these things, therefore, blah, blah, blah. No, it's meaning whole. So that's something to work towards. That's something I've tried. And so as I began to navigate this new reality, I would remind myself and try to always pose the question, what would love do in this situation? And I did that whether it was in regards to my relationship with my child, whether it was in regards to my relationship with my spouse or my other child, or my relationship to the church, because you can have a relationship with an organization, not just with people. And so as I began to give myself permission to take back that power and shed those layers of all the external cues and definitions and teachings and whatnot that I had led with up to that point, I I went even more deeply inward. I mean, I've always tried to lead my life with, growing up, it was called personal revelation. I learned the best that I could to connect with divine. I call it other things now. My inner voice, that inner wisdom, intuition, connecting with the divine, my spirit team, those in the other realm beyond. But once I started to create and define things for myself is when I really truly started to find peace. And it deepened the love and appreciation that I had for both of my kids, really. I learned that this was the same child that loved to play the piano, same heart, same soul. This was the same child who loved animals and was really good with animals. This is the same child who loves to hum, who I think even starts to do it without realizing it when they're happy, when they're in a, just a pleasant mood. And I do remember in our home when I started to hear him humming more again. That was a beautiful moment. I just began to truly see, it's like my eyes were literally opened. Like I've been focusing on the wrong things to define how my life should be, how my kids' lives should be, even my spouse's, and by extension, those around me, right? Um, and it was liberating. By doing that, I gave myself the freedom to begin to meet my child where he was at and see him for who he truly was and still is and is becoming, right? All of us are going through this process of becoming. There's no end point. Um, yeah.
That's beautiful. I'm all tearing up over here myself. And I hope anybody who's listening is focusing on the similarities that they're experiencing because I mean, I could identify with so much of what you just shared, the looking outside of myself for answers that my whole life had been that way. And this experience taught me how to look inside and to decide, I think, to um, decide what I believed and what mattered most to me. I see so many parents struggling with, they're so confused because there's just like massive amounts of information and coming at us all day, every day anyway. And then, they're taking in so much information and they're never taking the time to actually digest it. And I think that that's a learned skill. Um,
I do too.
you talk about not understanding and how hard that is. And I think, you know, I went through that too with just being hit with, I don't understand what happened.
Mhm.
How did this happen? I don't understand
Yeah.
I didn't understand how to help my daughter. There was this really steep learning curve. Um, I loved what you said about whole love is because that just really brought a couple of things to mind. Because I talk about how I've said that my experience taught me to love unconditionally, but sometimes I kind of get hung up on how to explain that. But I could explain the whole love easily because like, I love all of you, even the parts of you that challenge me, that
Mm,
that aren't the way I expected, the parts I don't understand. I love the whole being of you. You're
mhm,
right down to your essence. And it also taught me to love with my whole self. Like, I used to feel like there was this block. Like, I knew I had more love to give, but I couldn't get to it. And this whole experience taught me to love with my whole self in a way that that I just couldn't access before. And I would have never been able to access without this experience.
yeah. It's amazing how our loved ones, in this case, our kids, they can break your heart wide open, and it might be extremely painful in the beginning, but I've learned that's where the light can come in many forms. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And we just have to open up to that light.
Hmm.
And
Let it
I
in.
think part of that, you mentioned choosing love over fear,
Uh-huh.
and which can be so hard because the fear is so intense.
It is. And I
And
think that you are the fear until like, I didn't understand emotions and feelings and thoughts and somatic work like I do now. I totally cut you off. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
But you actually believe this is real. This is who I am. This is my reality now. And I don't know how I'm going to go forward. I don't know how to make sense of life. But when you can learn to separate yourself from that, it is a very, I'm not negating that it's not a very real response. It's happening. You are feeling a very visceral, physical response.
Mhm.
But there's so much beauty when you can learn to meet that energy and see it for what it's screaming for attention for. Like, it's got a message. And sometimes we're so, well, most of the time we're so caught up in, this feels really yucky. This feels so uncomfortable. I feel like I might die. Actually, I kind of wish I would, because this is so, so painful. Whether it's anxiety, whether it's worry, whether it's fear. I mean, in my case, there were literally times I was petrified. That is the correct word. Terrified, because those beliefs were so ingrained, so deeply ingrained. But again, that's an area where I learned I can separate myself from my thoughts, from my emotions, from my feelings, from these somatic responses, but not ignore them. That's not the same thing as ignoring them. And learn to listen to what needed to be heard and what it was there to teach me. Um, and that is part of this process of metabolizing them that I was talking about a little bit earlier. Um, I don't know. I can just keep talking. Probably not just this idea of eternal families and that coming into question was so difficult for me, but also I think so. I want to talk about gender for a minute. Probably most people understand and would agree that there are gender roles out there that are made up, right? That's why some of us were taught women's places in the home, especially if you're from a conservative faith background. That's the role of a woman, is mother and caretaker and nurturer and those kinds of things. Um, a woman's place is by her husband. The man's place is in the workforce and providing and protecting. And in my case, growing up in the LDS church, the men hold the priesthood. And so they preside over the home. with holding the priesthood if they're worthy. Um, so I really had in my mind what that there was male and female, and that was it. Again, I didn't know that sex and gender are not the same thing. Male and female is another way of saying you were assigned, a girl or a female at birth, or you were assigned a male at birth based on the genitalia. The gender of a person is how they feel on the inside. Growing up in the 80s, maybe I think you grew up in a similar time frame as me. It was to hear that someone was called a tomboy, a girl who liked sports, maybe dressed more, athletic or boy-like or whatever, had rough and tough interests, or maybe, you know, was just more masculine, maybe, was called a tomboy. Really, what that in more current terminology, all that's saying is yes, that person was, assigned female at birth, but they have interests and talents and abilities that are beyond that gender binary that says they're supposed to be a girl and play with dolls and play house and learn how to bake or whatever, right? And so gender is how that person feels on the inside. And there are some that maybe one day wake up and they're feeling a little more masculine, and they maybe that manifests in what goals they choose to pursue that day. And maybe other days they grow up feeling a little more on the feminine side, a little more wanting to curl up with a book or bake a cake or go and garden in their flower garden or whatever. But they feel both of those. They're not they truly experience life in a way that isn't just simply one gender or the other. And that's what non-binary is. They're truly experiencing life outside of this binary that has been constructed about gender and how people experience those masculine and feminine energies that we all have. We all have masculine energy. We all have feminine energy. And so, and I had another layer on top of that, and my eternal progression, right? My eternal well-being was attached to those gender roles. And so that was another layer I had to pull apart and realize it didn't make a person less worthy or less important or less loved because they experienced life in this way, which was outside of these gender roles, this gender binary. And in the case of my faith of origin, the this idea that there was only two and that's how God made it. Um, Again, that's another discussion. I just had to learn to look inward and listen to me, what my mind, my heart, and my soul were all communicating. Because your body knows. I've really learned how we've dismissed that part of ourselves for so long. We're so cerebral that we kind of ignore what's going on, or we don't realize that the option is available to us. What's going on down here? When you tense up about something, there's a reason, you know?
Mhm.
Um, and so that's sex, basically boils down to the the genitalia. Gender is how a person experiences those energies on the inside. And then gender expression is their creativity on the outside, how they like to dress, how they like to do their hair, how they like to do their makeup or no makeup, or jewelry or no jewelry, tattoos or no tattoos, shoes, what shoes they choose to wear or don't, body hair or no, and that's just part of it. It's also can be their chosen profession, their chosen, academic pursuits, work pursuits, relationship, you know.
Mhm.
So yeah, I had to really scrutinize a lot of deeply ingrained thoughts, which is another word for beliefs.
Yeah, and I think also I this isn't clearly formed in my mind, so hopefully I don't butcher it trying to
Mhm.
get it out my mouth, but I was thinking of different things that I went through with Helena where she was putting gauges in her ears, they put progressively bigger ones
Mhm.
until the holes in
Mhm.
their ears get bigger, and I was just horrified, like, "Why are you
Mhm.
ruining your body in this way?" Or with, when she started getting tattoos and, she had really long blonde hair and then she shaved half of it, and like everything I was taking is like some kind of personal insult and making it mean all of these horrible things.
Mhm.
When eventually I got to the place like, these are safe expressions, right? The compared to all the other stuff that we're dealing with here, putting holes in her ears and shaving the back of her hair, but I was like, I made that perfect body, right? So part of my evolution in this was kind of that realization of none of it was about me and just changing
Yeah.
my ideas even about like what was okay and what wasn't and freedom of expression and that just that she didn't have to fit in this neat little
Mhm.
box that she had always fit in her whole life, that she didn't have to be this one way. I was always trying to get her to go back to who she was before. Like, all at the end I wanted was for her to just be happy. Like, went from having a million hopes and dreams to I just want her to be happy.
Mhm. Yeah. And that is so powerful. That's actually huge to want someone you love to find happiness, because this focus on the external for so long has, I think, in some ways made happiness elusive for so many. But when you don't realize what you don't realize, or you don't see what you don't see, you just stay in those loops.
Yeah, and I didn't know best what happiness looked like for her.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a very natural stance to have, or viewpoint to have. We do think we know what's best for our parents, but it comes from a place, I learned this for myself, of wanting, for me anyway, wanting to grip onto that certainty. Like I knew what the best way my child's life should turn out looked like.
Mhm.
Um, but that was something I had to deal with. That came from me from a place of scarcity and not being able to see the abundance that was truly available, because I had had these kind of blinders on on both ways, front and side, and all of that.
Mhm. I have so many more questions I want to ask you, but we're going to run out of time.
Yeah,
So, one, I really appreciate just how vulnerable and open and honest you were in this conversation
sure.
about just things that aren't easy for parents to talk about. Um, but before we end this conversation, is there
Hmm.
anything that you wanted to get in today that we didn't cover?
I, I didn't have any expectations about what needed to be covered or not covered. But if there was a message that I could um, leave with those that are listening, is to just uh, choose choose grace for self and others, and choose curiosity. I, there's so much going on right now. The No Kings protest day was just a few days ago as we're recording. So I honestly think taking that approach would be beneficial, not just in interacting with the queer community, the LGBTQ plus community, transgender, non-binary individuals, but in all the ways. We want to keep our stories because we mistakenly think that they're keeping us safe. But when those stories no longer serve us, it's sometimes, I mean, they stem from an authentic place, usually sometime in much, much earlier years. But they start to hurt us and impede us in our growth when we cannot see or recognize them as that, as stories that can be reconsidered and even redefined or rewritten.
Mhm. I think curiosity is so helpful. Like,
Mm-hmm.
in our coach training, like one of the like looking at things, is there another way to look at this?
Mm-hmm.
How else can I see this? And that idea that maybe everything I've known, like it's all been, I've been conditioned to believe all of these things. So how about I
Mm-hmm.
take the time to be just curious
Mm-hmm.
about anything I come across and take the time to make a really intentional, well informed decision about how I feel about that. Just look at everything
Mm-hmm.
differently.
Yeah, I've learned there is nothing more empowering than releasing a belief, getting curious about it, re-examining it, even if I go back and re-choose, reintegrate, re-embrace that belief. That is where your power truly lies.
Mhm. Yeah. Just taking the time to make those decisions, decide what you believe.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, thank you so much for being here today. And I'm going to put the link to Megan's new book in the show notes. I'll
Mm-hmm.
also put the link to her website in case you want to reach out to her. But thank you so much for being here
Yeah.
today.
Thank you, Heather. I loved being here with you. Appreciate it.